The wind howled across the frozen plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of death. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets that turned the world into a white void where direction meant nothing and hope grew thinner with each passing hour. The winter of 1847 had been particularly brutal, claiming lives across the territories where the Apache and Sioux nations struggled to survive in an increasingly hostile world. Pressed her face against the small opening of her winter shelter, watching the storm rage outside. At 28, she had lived through many harsh winters, but this one felt different. The cold seemed to penetrate not just her bones, but her very spirit. Her husband had been gone for 3 moons now, taken by the same sickness that had swept through their band earlier in the season. She was alone in ways that went deeper than the physical isolation of the storm. Her fingers traced the intricate beadwork on her medicine pouch, a wedding gift from her grandmother who had passed the previous spring. The old woman had always told her that the spirits would test her strength when she needed it most, and that her true character would be revealed in moments of darkness. As the wind continued its relentless assault on her shelter, wondered if this was one of those moments. The Apache camp was scattered across a protected valley, with each family maintaining their own winter lodge. It was their way to spread out during the harshest months, reducing the strain on limited resources while still remaining close enough for mutual support. But the current storm had been raging for 2 days, making movement between shelters impossible. Each person was truly on their own until the weather cleared. Shelter was positioned slightly apart from the others, near a grove of cottonwood trees that provided additional protection from the wind. Her husband had chosen this spot carefully, knowing that the trees would break the worst of the winter storms while still allowing them to remain connected to their people. Now, in her solitude, she appreciated his wisdom even as she mourned his absence. She turned away from the opening and added another piece of dried wood to her small fire. The smoke curled upward through the carefully constructed opening at the top of her lodge, and she watched it disappear into the white chaos outside. Food was becoming a concern. She had enough dried meat and roots to last perhaps another week if she was careful, but the storm showed no signs of letting up. As she settled back onto her sleeping robes, heard something that made her blood freeze. It was faint at first, almost lost in the howling wind, but there was a rhythm to it that was distinctly human. Someone was crying out in the storm. She pressed her ear against the hide wall of her shelter, straining to hear over the wind. There it was again, definitely voices, and they sounded young. Children's voices calling out in desperation. But the words were not Apache. They were speaking Lakota, the language of the Sioux. His heart began to race. The Sioux were traditional enemies of her people, their territories overlapping in ways that had led to countless conflicts over the generations. To help Sioux children would be seen as betrayal by many in her band. But the voices she heard were so young, so filled with terror, that her maternal instincts overrode all political considerations. She quickly began pulling on her heaviest winter clothing, wrapping herself in layers of buffalo hide and rabbit fur. The storm outside was a killer, but she could not sit safely in her warm shelter while children froze to death just beyond her walls. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, true character revealed in moments of darkness. The cold hit her like a physical blow as she pushed through the opening of her shelter. The wind immediately tried to knock her down, and the snow stung her exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her, but she pressed forward in the direction of the voices. "Help us," the cry came again, closer now and definitely in the Sioux language. Had learned some Lakota words from trading encounters over the years, enough to understand basic communication. These children were lost and terrified. She called out in response, first in Apache, then in the few Lakota words she knew. "Here, come to my voice, I will help you." Through the swirling snow, she saw movement. 2 small figures stumbled toward her, barely able to stand against the wind. As they drew closer, she could see they were boys, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, their faces blue with cold and their eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. The older boy was supporting the younger one, who seemed barely conscious. Both were woefully underdressed for such weather, wearing only light buckskin clothing that offered little protection against the brutal cold. Their lips were purple, and she could see that they were beyond shivering, a dangerous sign that their bodies were beginning to shut down. Without hesitation, gathered both boys into her arms, half carrying them back toward her shelter. The younger boy was so light that she feared he might already be too far gone, but she could feel his heart still beating weakly against her chest. Getting all three of them through the narrow opening of her lodge was difficult, but she managed it, dragging the boys inside before collapsing herself. The contrast between the howling chaos outside and the relative warmth and quiet of her shelter was startling. In the firelight, she could better assess the condition of her unexpected guests. Both boys were severely hypothermic, their skin pale and cold to the touch. The younger one's breathing was shallow and irregular, while the older boy, though conscious, seemed to be in shock. Immediately began the process of warming them, but she knew she had to be careful. Warming someone too quickly after severe cold exposure could be as dangerous as the cold itself. She removed their wet clothing and wrapped them in her own sleeping robes, then moved them close to the fire, but not too close. The older boy's eyes focused on her face, and she saw recognition there. He knew she was Apache, and she could see the confusion and fear in his expression. In his weakened state, he was completely at her mercy, and they both knew it. "You are safe," she told him in halting Lakota, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "I will not hurt you." The boy stared at her for a long moment, then whispered something she couldn't understand. She leaned closer and he repeated it. "Thank you," he was saying. "Thank you." Spent the next several hours fighting for the lives of both children. She prepared warm broths from her precious stores of food, forcing small amounts between their blue lips. She massaged their hands and feet to restore circulation, ignoring their cries of pain as feeling returned to their frozen extremities. The younger boy was the more critical case. His breathing remained labored, and his body temperature seemed to fluctuate dangerously. Several times during that first night, thought she might lose him. She sang traditional Apache healing songs over his small form, calling on all the spiritual power she could summon. The older boy, who told her his name was, gradually regained his strength enough to speak. In broken Apache words mixed with Lakota and hand signs, he told her their story. They had been traveling with their family to winter hunting grounds when a sudden storm separated them from the main group. They had been lost for 2 days, surviving by finding temporary shelter in rock formations and sharing their body heat. "My brother," said, pointing to the unconscious younger boy, he is only 7 winters. He fell through ice yesterday. His clothes froze to his body." Felt her heart break for these children. To be lost in such weather was almost certainly a death sentence, especially for one so young. That they had survived even 2 days was remarkable. As the night wore on, she found herself growing increasingly attached to the boys. Reminded her of the children she had always hoped to have with her husband, and's brave attempts to protect his younger brother touched something deep in her soul. But she also knew that her actions would have consequences. When the storm cleared and her own people discovered that she had harbored Sioux children, there would be questions. Some would call her a traitor. Others might demand that she turn the boys over to the War Council. The Apache and Sioux had been enemies for generations. Raids, counter-raids, stolen horses, and taken scalps had created a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end. These very children might grow up to be warriors who would someday fight against her own people. Yet as she looked at its peaceful face as he finally fell into natural sleep, and its grateful eyes, she knew she could never regret her choice. They were children, innocent of the crimes of their elders, deserving of life and protection regardless of the circumstances of their birth. By morning, the storm had begun to weaken, though snow still fell steadily. Its condition had stabilized, and both boys were able to take more substantial food, began to plan for what would come next. The boys' family would be searching for them, assuming they had survived the initial storm. Sioux warriors would be combing the territory, and eventually they would find the Apache camp. When they did, the situation could easily turn violent if not handled carefully. She also had to consider her own people. The storm would end, and her neighbors would emerge from their shelters. They would see the smoke from her fire, smell the additional cooking, and eventually discover her guests. She needed to be prepared for their reactions. Seemed to understand the complexity of the situation. Despite his youth, he had been raised in a warrior culture and knew the history between their peoples. "We bring danger to you," he said in his broken Apache. "I am sorry." "You bring no danger that I did not choose," replied. "But we must be smart about what comes next." She began to formulate a plan. The boys needed more time to recover their strength before they could travel, but keeping them in the camp much longer would create problems. She decided that when the weather cleared enough for travel, she would take them partway back towards Sioux territory, to a neutral area where they might be found by their own people without compromising her position. But even as she made these practical plans, found herself hopping for more time with the children. In just one day and night, they had filled an emptiness in her heart that she hadn't fully realized existed. Shy smile when he finally felt well enough to sit up, earnest attempts to help her with small tasks despite his weakness. Both had awakened maternal feelings she had kept buried since her husband's death. The second day brought clearer skies but continued cold. Ventured outside several times to check conditions and to gather more firewood. Each time, she scanned the horizon for signs of movement, knowing that searchers from both sides would soon be active. During these quiet hours in the shelter, the three of them began to develop a strange but genuine bond. Language barriers made conversation difficult, but they communicated through gestures, shared meals, and simple human kindness. The boys helped her with small tasks, organizing her supplies and tending the fire, while she continued to nurse them back to health. Proved to be remarkably intelligent and observant, he studied everything about Apache life that he could see in her small shelter, asking questions about her tools, her clothing, and her customs. He seemed particularly fascinated by her beadwork and the stories behind the patterns. "My grandmother makes similar designs," he told her, pointing to a geometric pattern on her winter shirt. "But with different colors, blue like sky, not red like sunset." These cultural exchanges were eye-opening for as well. She had always been taught that the Sioux were fundamentally different from her people, alien in their customs and beliefs. But listening to descriptions of his family life, she heard echoes of her own upbringing. Both peoples honored their elders, both followed the seasonal patterns of hunting and gathering, both told stories around winter fires that taught the young about courage and wisdom. On the third day, as she was returning from gathering water from a nearby stream, spotted something that made her heart race. Smoke was rising from 3 different locations in the distance, too far to be from her own people's shelters. Search parties were active, and they were getting closer. She hurried back to her lodge to find both boys alert and worried. They had heard the distant sound of horses, and their expressions told her they knew what it meant. "They come for us," said simply. "Yes," replied, "we must prepare." The time for difficult choices had arrived. Soon, she would have to decide how to handle the approaching searchers, and whatever decision she made would change her life forever. The storm had brought her these children, but it had also brought her to a crossroads that would test everything she believed about honor, loyalty, and the true meaning of courage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered landscape as made her final preparations. The distant smoke columns had grown closer during the night, and she could now hear the faint sounds of search parties moving through the valley. Both Apache and Sioux groups were converging on the area, drawn by the same logical places where lost children might seek shelter. Sat quietly near the fire, his arm around his younger brother, both boys understanding that their brief sanctuary was about to end. In the 3 days they had spent together, an unlikely family had formed in this small lodge, bound not by blood, but by shared humanity in the face of nature's cruelty. "Tell me about your family," said to as she packed supplies into a leather bag. She spoke in the mixture of Apache, Lakota, and hand signs they had developed as their common language. "Your brother who searches for you." His face brightened despite their circumstances. "Is the strongest warrior in our band," he said with obvious pride. 23 winters old, he could track a fish through water and fight 10 men alone. The boy's admiration for his older brother was clear in every word. "When our parents died from the spotted sickness 2 years ago, became father and mother both. He teaches me to hunt, to fight, to be brave," he says, and I are his heart walking outside his body. Though still weak, managed a small smile. "Tells the best stories," he whispered, "about the old days when the buffalo covered the earth like brown snow." Felt a pang in her chest. These children had already lost so much, and now they faced separation from the brother who had become their world. She understood too well the pain of losing family, the desperate need to hold onto those who remained. The sound of horses grew closer and made her decision. "We must go now," she said firmly, "before the search parties find this place." She had spent the morning scouting a route to a neutral valley about 2 miles north, a place where boundaries between tribal territories blurred, and where the boys might be safely recovered by their own people without directly implicating her. It was risky, but it offered the best chance for everyone to emerge from this situation without bloodshed. Wrapping the boys in warm robes and gathering her supplies led them out into the crisp morning air. The storm had finally passed completely, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. The beauty was breathtaking, but she had no time to appreciate it. They moved carefully through the trees, following game trails that would mask their passage. Despite his ordeal, proved to be surprisingly capable in the wilderness, helping to support his younger brother and staying alert for danger. Struggled more, but his determination to keep up was touching. "You are brave children," told them as they rested briefly in a protected grove. "Your brother will be proud when he finds you." "Will you be in trouble with your people?" asked, his young face serious with concern. "Because you helped us." The question revealed a wisdom beyond his years, an understanding of the complex political realities that governed their world. Considered her answer carefully. "Perhaps," she said honestly, "but sometimes doing right is more important than staying safe." As they continued their journey, found herself thinking about the conversation she would soon have to have with her own people. Chief was a fair leader, but he was also a practical man who understood that tribal survival sometimes required difficult choices. Some of the younger warriors might see her actions as a betrayal, a sign of weakness that could be exploited by enemies. But her grandmother's teachings had always emphasized that true strength came from compassion, not from hatred. "A heart that cannot feel for others becomes small and hard," the old woman had often said, "and a small, hard heart cannot lead a people to greatness." They reached the neutral valley by midday, a beautiful spot where a small stream meandered between snow-covered hills. Ancient petroglyphs on the surrounding rocks told stories of the many peoples who had passed this way over countless generations, and felt the weight of that history as she prepared to say goodbye to the children. "This is where we part," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Your people will find you here soon. Follow the stream toward the rising sun, and you will come to familiar territory." Both boys looked stricken. In their few days together, bonds had formed that transcended tribal loyalties. Stepped forward and awkwardly embraced her, a gesture that broke nearly every rule of his warrior training but felt completely natural in the moment. "You saved our lives," he said simply. "I will remember you always." Little was crying openly as he too hugged her legs. "Will we see you again?" he asked. Knelt down to his level, taking his small face in her hands. "The spirits work in mysterious ways, little one. Perhaps our paths will cross again someday." She pressed a small carved bone pendant into his palm, a protective charm her grandmother had made. "Keep this to remember that kindness exists in the world, even between enemies." As she prepared to leave them, called out to her, "What is your name, so I can tell who saved us?" "I am of the Chiricahua Apache," she replied. "Tell your brother that his courage in searching for you honors his family." The journey back to her camp was the hardest thing had ever done. Every step took her further from the children who had filled the empty spaces in her heart, back toward a life that suddenly seemed colorless and hollow. But she knew she had done the right thing, regardless of the consequences. She arrived at her shelter just as the first Apache search parties were returning to camp. The storm had prevented any organized search efforts until now, and she was able to slip back into her routine without immediate questions. But she knew that wouldn't last long. Chief visited her shelter that evening, ostensibly to check on her welfare after the storm, but clearly aware that something had changed. He was a perceptive man who had ruled their band for over 20 years, and very little escaped his notice. "The storm was hard," he said, accepting the cup of pine needle tea she offered. "We lost 2 elders and several horses, but the spirits smiled on most of our people." "The spirits test us in winter," replied carefully, "but they also teach us about our true nature." Studied her face in the firelight. "Wisdom often comes at a price. I hope you will share any lessons learned when the time is right." That night, alone in her shelter, lay awake thinking about the children. Were they safe? Had their people found them? Was at this very moment telling his brother about the Apache woman who had saved their lives? Meanwhile, in a Sioux camp 40 miles to the north, a young warrior named stood before the tribal council, his face etched with grief and desperate determination. For 4 days, he had searched without rest for his missing brothers, following every possible trail through the storm-ravaged landscape. "They are still alive," he insisted, though exhaustion made his voice hoarse. "I know it in my heart is strong and clever. He would find shelter, keep warm. We must not give up the search." Several of the elder warriors exchanged glances. They had seen too many children lost to winter storms to share his optimism. But's devotion to his brothers was legendary among their people, and his tracking skills were unmatched. "One more day," agreed Chief Red Hawk reluctantly. "But if the search party finds no trace by sunset tomorrow, we must accept that the storm has claimed them." Nodded curtly and turned to leave, but the chief called him back. "My son," Red Hawk said gently, "you have already done everything a brother could do. If the spirits have called them home, your grief will not bring them back." "Respectfully, my chief," replied, "while breath remains in my body, I will not abandon them. They are all the family I have left in this world." As the council meeting ended, gathered his supplies for another day of searching. He had covered hundreds of miles in the past 4 days, following every possible route the boys might have taken. Tomorrow, he planned to search the southern territories, closer to Apache lands than any Sioux warrior had ventured in years. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Set out before sunrise, his horse's breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. He followed the stream valleys where travelers seeking shelter would naturally go, reading the landscape like a book written in snow and stone. By noon, he had reached the neutral valley where had left his brothers. At first, he saw only the pristine snow and the ancient rock paintings, but his trained eye soon picked up signs that others would have missed. Disturbed snow around the stream bank, the faint impression of small feet near a cluster of boulders. His heart began to race as he dismounted and examined the area more carefully. There, partially hidden under a fallen branch, he found a piece of torn fabric that he recognized as coming from Winter's shirt. Fresh hope flooded through him as he called their names. The answering cries came from a shelter the boys had constructed among the rocks, following survival techniques had taught them. When he saw their faces peering out from their improvised hideout, alive and relatively healthy, he felt tears freeze on his cheeks. The reunion was everything had hoped it would be. Gathered both boys in his powerful arms, holding them as if he would never let them go again. For several minutes, none of them could speak through their tears. Finally found his voice. "We have something important to tell you about how we survived." As they made their way back toward Sioux territory and told their brother the complete story of their rescue, listened in growing amazement and disbelief. An Apache woman had saved his brother's lives, fed them, nursed them back to health, and then guided them to safety without asking for anything in return. Her name was, said proudly. She was kind and brave and beautiful. She sang healing songs over when we thought he might die. Pulled out the carved bone pendant had given him. "She gave me this to remember that kindness exists even between enemies." That's what she said. Examined the pendant, recognizing the skilled craftsmanship and the protective symbols carved into its surface. This was not a casual gift, but something precious, given from the heart. "She saved our lives," continued. "We would have died without her help. She risked everything for us, even though we are Sioux and she is Apache." That night, as they camped within sight of their home territory, stared up at the star-filled sky, and wrestled with emotions he had never experienced before. Gratitude, certainly, but something deeper as well. This unknown Apache woman had shown a courage and compassion that challenged everything he had been taught about his people's enemies. He thought about his own raids against Apache camps, the horses he had stolen, the warriors he had fought. Had any of those Apache people had family members capable of such selfless kindness? Had he brought grief to people who might have shown mercy to his own family in return? "I must find her," he said suddenly, startling his brothers who thought he was asleep. "What do you mean?" asked. "This Apache woman, she saved your lives at great risk to herself. Honor demands that I thank her properly." "But she is Apache," said confused. "Are they not our enemies?" Was quiet for a long time before answering. "I thought I knew who our enemies were, little brother, but an enemy would not have risked her life to save yours. Perhaps some of the old teachings need to be questioned." The idea that began forming in his mind was both simple and revolutionary. He would find this woman and thank her personally for saving his brothers. It was a gesture that would require tremendous courage, as it would mean entering Apache territory alone and unarmed, trusting in the honor of people his culture had taught him to hate. But as he looked at his sleeping brothers, healthy and alive because of one woman's compassion, he knew he had no choice. Honor demanded no less, and his heart would know no peace until the debt was paid. The journey to find would be the most dangerous he had ever undertaken, but also the most important. It would test not only his courage and tracking skills, but his willingness to see beyond the ancient hatreds that divided their peoples. 3 weeks had passed since had left the two Sioux boys in the neutral valley, and the memory of their grateful faces haunted her dreams. She went through the motions of daily life in the Apache camp, but part of her spirit seemed to have remained with And. She found herself constantly wondering if they had been safely reunited with their family, if they were warm and well-fed, if they remembered her kindness. The questions about her activities during the storm had begun quietly, but were growing more persistent. Several of her neighbors had noticed the extra firewood she had burned, the unusual amount of food she had prepared, the scent of healing herbs that had lingered around her shelter. Chief had not pressed her directly, but she could see the questions in his eyes whenever they spoke. It was a young warrior with ambitions for leadership who finally confronted her directly. He appeared at her shelter one evening as she was preparing her dinner, his face set in stern lines that reminded her uncomfortably of his father, who had died fighting the Sioux 3 years earlier. "There are stories," he said without preamble, settling himself uninvited by her fire. "Stories that during the storm you were not alone in your shelter." Continued stirring her stew, keeping her expression neutral. "Stories have a way of growing in the telling, like shadows at sunset. The tracker says he found unusual sign near your shelter. Footprints too small to be yours, but not made by any Apache children. And the horses smell Sioux scent on the wind from this direction." Leaned forward, his eyes hard. "If you aided our enemies, even children, you have betrayed every Apache who died by Sioux hands, my father among them." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from a poisoned fire. Set down her stirring stick and met his gaze directly. She had known this moment would come, and she had spent weeks preparing for it. "Your father was a brave warrior," she said quietly. "He died defending our people, and his memory deserves honor. But tell me, would his spirit be proud to know that his son would condemn a woman for showing mercy to freezing children?" "Sioux children grow into Sioux warriors," shot back. "Children who raid our camps, steal our horses, kill our people. How many Apache will die because you allowed two future enemies to live?" Before could respond, Chief appeared at the entrance to her shelter. The old leader moved with quiet dignity, but she could see the weight of leadership in his tired eyes. Behind him stood 3 of the tribal elders, their faces grave. "This conversation concerns the whole band," said simply. "It should be held before the council fire where all may hear and speak." An hour later, most of the adult members of the band had gathered around the central fire. The accusations against had spread quickly through the camp, and the debate that followed was heated and passionate. Some, led by, demanded that she be banished for treason. Others argued that mercy was a virtue that honored their people. When called upon to defend herself, stood slowly and looked around the circle of faces, many of them people she had known since childhood. She saw disappointment, anger, confusion, and in a few faces, understanding. "I will not lie to you," she began, her voice clear and strong. "During the storm, I found 2 Sioux children lost and freezing. They were boys, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, nearly dead from cold and hunger. I brought them into my shelter, warmed them, fed them, and nursed them back to health. When they were strong enough to travel, I guided them to a neutral place where their own people could find them safely." A murmur ran through the gathering, some voices angry, others surprised. Leaped to his feet. "You admit it. You admit to aiding our enemies." "I admit to saving 2 children from death," replied calmly. "Children who had done no harm to any Apache, who knew only fear and cold and the approach of death." Old, the oldest woman in the band, spoke up from her place near the fire. "In the old stories, the spirits often test us by appearing as strangers in need. How do we know these children were not such a test?" "Because they were Sioux," shouted. "The spirits do not dress as our enemies to test our loyalty." "Do they not?" asked quietly, and his words carried the authority of his years and wisdom. "I have heard many stories of spirits taking unexpected forms to teach important lessons." The debate continued deep into the night, with passionate arguments on both sides. Some spoke of the practical dangers of showing mercy to potential enemies. Others talked about the moral obligations that came with strength and security. A few shared stories of kindness received from unexpected sources during their own times of need. Finally, when the fire had burned low and voices had grown hoarse from talking, Chief called for silence. "This is a decision for the Council of Elders," he announced. "We will deliberate and give our judgment tomorrow evening." As the gathering broke up, several people approached to offer quiet words of support, while others pointedly avoided looking at her. The division in the band was clear, and she knew that regardless of the council's decision, her actions had changed something fundamental in her relationship with her people. That night, as she lay sleepless in her shelter, heard the soft sound of approaching footsteps. She tensed, wondering if someone had come to confront her privately, but the voice that called softly from outside was that of her friend. "May I enter, sister?" Welcomed her gratefully. Was one of the most respected women in the band, a skilled healer and the mother of 4 children. Her opinion carried weight with many people. "I wanted to ask you something," said as she settled by the fire. "The boys you saved, what were they like?" His face softened as she remembered. The older one was brave beyond his years. Even near death, he was trying to protect his little brother, and the younger one had such a sweet spirit. When he smiled, it was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "You speak of them with affection." "How could I not? They were just children, frightened, lost children who needed help. When I looked at them, I saw not Sioux enemies but small boys who reminded me of the children I always hoped to have." Nodded thoughtfully. "I have 4 sons, as you know. If they were lost in a blizzard in Sioux territory, I would pray to every spirit that exists for some kind woman to take them in and warm them by her fire. But in the others, they see only future enemies. Sees the world through the pain of his father's death, but pain, while understandable, does not always lead to wisdom." Reached over and squeezed hand. "You acted from your heart, sister. That takes courage." The next evening, the Council of Elders announced their decision. Chief spoke for the group, his words carefully chosen. "Of the Chiricahua has acted according to her conscience in showing mercy to children in desperate need. While some question the wisdom of this action, none can question its courage or its adherence to the ancient values of compassion that our grandmothers taught." He paused, looking around the circle of faces. "However, such actions carry consequences. To maintain the safety of our band, must understand that any future contact with Sioux people must be reported immediately to the council, and she will be watched to ensure that her compassion does not compromise our security." It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but avoided splitting the band apart. Was not banished, but she was now marked as someone whose loyalty was questioned. The shadow of suspicion would follow her, affecting her relationships and her standing in the community. Meanwhile, 200 miles to the north, was making his own difficult preparations. For 3 weeks, he had been planning his journey to find and thank the Apache woman who had saved his brothers. It would be a mission that required not only physical courage, but a willingness to challenge everything his culture had taught him about honor and enemies. The Sioux Council had been less understanding than the Apache elders when announced his intentions. Chief Red Hawk and the other leaders saw his plan as dangerous folly that could endanger the entire band. "You speak of honor," Red Hawk said during a heated council session, "but what honor is there in riding to your death among enemies? Your brothers are safe. That should be enough." "With respect, my chief," replied, "it is not enough. This woman risked everything to save, and she could have left them to die or worse, taken them as slaves. Instead, she treated them as her own children and asked for nothing in return. Such kindness creates a debt that honor demands I repay. And what of the danger to our people if you are captured and tortured for information about our camp, our numbers, our movements?" Had thought long about this concern. "I will go alone and unmarked, carrying nothing that identifies our band. If I am killed, it will be as an individual, not as a representative of our people." The discussion that followed was even more intense than the one that had taken place around the Apache fire. Some of the younger warriors supported its plan, inspired by its romantic idealism. Others, particularly the older men who had lost family members to Apache raids, saw it as betrayal. In the end, the council reached a similar compromise to their Apache counterparts. Would not be forbidden from making his journey, but he would go without the band's official support or protection. If he was killed or captured, the tribe would disavow any knowledge of his mission. "You are a grown man and a proven warrior," Red Hawk said finally. "But understand that if you choose this path, you choose it alone. The consequences, whatever they may be, will be yours to bear." That night, as made his final preparations, his brothers came to speak with him one last time. Both boys had been deeply affected by the kindness they had received from, and their perspective on Apache people had changed fundamentally. "She was not what I expected an enemy to be," said seriously. "She was gentle and kind like our own grandmother was. She sang to me when I was sick," added. "Apache songs, but they felt like love in any language." Knelt down to embrace both boys. "I may not return from this journey," he told them honestly. "If that happens, you must be strong and remember everything I have taught you about being warriors and men." "You will return," said with fierce certainty. "The spirits that guided us to her will guide you safely back to us." As dawn broke over the Sioux camp, mounted his fastest horse and began the most important journey of his life. He rode south toward Apache territory, carrying only basic supplies and weapons for hunting. Most importantly, he carried a gift carefully wrapped in soft leather, something he hoped would properly express his gratitude for kindness. The gift was a necklace that had belonged to his mother, made of rare blue stones and silver that had been traded from distant tribes. It was one of his most precious possessions, but he could think of nothing else valuable enough to offer in exchange for his brothers' lives. As he rode through the wilderness that separated their peoples, had time to think about the magnitude of what he was attempting. He was voluntarily entering enemy territory to seek out a specific person, with no guarantee that he could find her or that she would even agree to meet with him if he did. But the memory of his brothers' faces when they spoke of kindness drove him forward. Some debts, he had learned, were more important than safety or convention. Some acts of courage were required not by law or custom, but by the simple demands of an honorable heart. The journey would take him across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory, through lands where Apache war parties regularly patrolled. Every mile brought new risks, new chances for disaster. But with each step his horse took toward the south, felt more certain that this was something he had to do. Honor, he realized, was not just about fighting enemies or defending territory. Sometimes, the greatest honor came from recognizing goodness wherever it appeared and being brave enough to acknowledge it, even when doing so challenged everything you had been taught to believe. Had been traveling south for 6 days when he encountered the first Apache patrol. He was carefully picking his way through a narrow canyon when the warriors appeared on the rim above him, their weapons drawn and their faces painted for war. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, hunter and hunted stared at each other across the rocky divide. "Sioux Dog," called out the leader of the Apache patrol, a veteran named who had lost an eye in a raid 2 summers before. "You are far from home and surrounded. Surrender your weapons and you may live long enough to explain your presence in our lands." Slowly raised his hands, showing that he carried no weapons except a hunting knife and a bow strung across his back. "I come in peace," he called back in careful Apache words he had been practicing during his journey. "I seek one among your people to repay a debt of honor." The Apache warriors looked at each other in confusion. It was unheard of for a Sioux warrior to enter their territory alone and unarmed, speaking of honor and debts. Signaled for 2 of his men to circle around behind the canyon while he maintained his position above. "You speak strangely for a raider," said suspiciously. "What debt could a Sioux owe to Apache people?" "One of your women saved the lives of my brothers during the great storm 3 weeks past. I come to thank her and offer gifts in recognition of her kindness." The words caused an immediate stir among the Apache warriors. Stories of the storm and its aftermath had spread throughout their territory, and while details were often confused or exaggerated, everyone knew that children had been lost and found during those terrible days. "What woman?" demanded. "And what proof do you offer that your words are true?" Carefully reached into his saddlebag and a small object, holding it up for the warriors to see. It was bone pendant, the protective charm that had given the boy as a parting gift. "My youngest brother carried this from your woman's hand. She called herself of the Chiricahua Apache." The pendant was passed from warrior to warrior, each man examining the intricate carvings and recognizing the distinctive style of Apache craftsmanship. More importantly, several of them recognized the specific symbols and patterns as the work of his grandmother, a renowned artist whose pieces were treasured throughout their band. His expression grew more thoughtful, though no less cautious. "Even if your story is true, what makes you think we would allow you to approach one of our women? You could be a spy, seeking information about our camps and defenses." "I carry no weapons of war," replied. I seek no knowledge of your people's movements or strength. I ask only for the chance to complete an obligation of honor. If you will guide me to this woman, I will speak my words of gratitude, offer my gifts, and depart immediately." For several long minutes, the Apache warriors debated among themselves in their own language. Could catch only fragments of their conversation, but he could sense the tension between caution and curiosity. Finally, made his decision. "You will surrender your weapons and travel bound under guard. If this is a trap, if you attempt to escape or cause harm to any of our people, you will die slowly and badly. Do you accept these terms?" Dismounted and laid his bow and knife on the ground. "I accept." The journey to the Apache camp took 2 days, during which was treated with the wary respect due to a dangerous but temporarily harmless enemy. The warriors questioned him extensively about his story, testing for inconsistencies or signs of deception. Answered honestly, describing his brother's rescue in detail and explaining his own motivation for seeking out their savior. By the time they reached the camp, word of the unusual visitor had spread ahead of them. A crowd of curious Apache people had gathered to see the Sioux warrior who claimed to have come in peace to thank one of their women. The reaction was mixed, with some showing open hostility while others seemed intrigued by the unprecedented nature of his mission. Chief emerged from his lodge to personally examine the stranger. The old leader had heard reports of claims during the journey, and now he studied the young warrior with keen eyes that had seen many deceptions over the years. "You are either very brave or very foolish," observed. "Perhaps both. You risk your life to thank a woman you have never met for showing kindness to children you could have simply mourned and forgotten." "With respect, great chief," replied, "these children are my heart walking outside my body. When someone saves them, she saves me as well. How could I forget such a gift?" Nodded slowly. He was a father and grandfather himself, and he understood the depth of devotion that could drive a man to such extremes. "Is a woman of our band, but she has recently faced questions about her actions during the storm. Your arrival may cause complications." "I do not wish to bring trouble to her," said quickly. "If my presence would cause her harm, I will leave immediately, but if I may speak to her even briefly, I would be grateful." The chief considered the request carefully. The political situation in the camp was delicate, with many people still debating actions and their implications. Some would see arrival as proof that her kindness had been foolish, creating dangerous connections with enemy peoples. Others might interpret it as validation of her compassion. After consulting with the Council of Elders, decided to allow the meeting under carefully controlled conditions. Would be summoned to the Central Council fire, where she could speak with in the presence of witnesses. Guards would remain close, ready to intervene if necessary. When received word that a Sioux warrior was asking to see her, her first thought was of and had something happened to them? Was this man bringing news of their fate? She hurried to the council fire with her heart racing, unsure what to expect. The sight that greeted her was unlike anything she had ever imagined. A tall, powerful warrior sat cross-legged near the fire, his hands bound but his bearing proud and dignified. Despite his restraints, there was nothing of the defeated captive about him. His eyes, when they met hers, were filled with an intensity that took her breath away. "You are," said, and it was not a question. "I see in your face the kindness that my brothers described." "You are their brother," she replied, understanding flooding through her. "Spoke of you often. He said you were the strongest warrior in your band." "I am called. I have traveled many days to find you and speak words that must be spoken." Despite the presence of guards and the tension in the air, something passed between them in that moment of recognition. Saw not a dangerous enemy, but a man driven by love and honor to attempt something unprecedented. Saw not a stranger, but the woman who had saved his family when all seemed lost. "Your brothers," said anxiously, "are they well? Did they reach your people safely?" His face brightened with genuine joy. "They are healthy and strong, thanks to your care. Grows more skilled as a hunter each day, and little laughter fills our lodge again. They speak of you often and with great affection." Relief washed over his features. The uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks was finally resolved. The boys were safe, reunited with their family, living the lives she had fought to preserve. "I am glad," she said simply. "They are good children who deserve to live and grow. For this gift of life you gave them, I have come to offer what thanks I can." Nodded to one of the Apache guards who brought forward a leather bundle. I have brought something that belonged to my mother. May she rest in peace. It is small payment for so great a debt, but I offer it from my heart." He unwrapped the necklace carefully, revealing the beautiful blue stones and silver work that had been crafted by master artisans from distant tribes. Even in the firelight, the jewelry was clearly valuable, representing not just monetary worth but deep sentimental meaning. A murmur ran through the gathered Apache people. The necklace was beautiful enough to be worn by a chief's daughter, and the fact that was offering such a treasure demonstrated the sincerity of his gratitude. Stared at the gift in amazement. She had never owned anything so fine, and the thought that this man had carried it hundreds of miles through enemy territory just to thank her was overwhelming. "I cannot accept this," she said finally. "What I did required no payment. The children needed help and I gave it, that is all." "You say that is all, but for me it is everything," replied with quiet intensity. "When they were lost, I felt my own life ending. You brought them back to me, and with them you returned my reason for living. How can such a gift go unrewarded?" The conversation that followed was unlike any that had ever taken place between members of their two tribes. Despite the formal setting and the presence of guards, and found themselves speaking as if they were old friends, sharing stories of the children and their own experiences during those difficult days. Described his frantic search through the storm, the desperation that had driven him to continue when others would have given up, the moment of incredible joy when he found his brothers alive. Spoke of her own emotional journey, the way caring for the boys had filled an emptiness in her heart she hadn't fully acknowledged. "They brought unexpected blessing into my life," she admitted. "During the darkest time of winter, when my husband's death still felt fresh, caring for and gave me purpose and hope again." "Then you understand why I had to come," said. "Some debts transcend the boundaries of tribe and tradition. When someone saves what you love most in the world, gratitude becomes a sacred obligation." As the evening progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The initial tension in the camp gave way to a curious fascination with this unprecedented meeting. Even some of those who had criticized its actions found themselves moved by the obvious sincerity of submission. Old, the eldest woman in the band, spoke up from her place near the fire. "I have lived through 80 winters and seen many things, but never have I witnessed an enemy warrior risk his life simply to say thank you. This speaks well of both peoples." Chief, who had been observing the proceedings carefully, made a decision that would be talked about for generations. "Of the Sioux has traveled far to honor a debt of gratitude. Let it not be said that the Chiricahua Apache lack honor in return. You will be our guest this night, sharing our fire and food. Tomorrow, you will depart safely with an escort to ensure your passage through our territory." The decision caused another stir among the assembled people, but the chief's word was final. For the first time in the long history of conflict between their peoples, a Sioux warrior would spend the night as an honored guest in an Apache camp. As the formal gathering broke up and people began to return to their lodges, lingered by the fire, the necklace lay in her hands, its weight somehow representing all the complexity of the situation she found herself in. "You should keep it," said softly, having been allowed to approach her one final time before being taken to a guarded lodge for the night. "Not as payment for what you did, but as a reminder that kindness creates connections stronger than hatred." "Will I ever see your brothers again?" asked. Was quiet for a moment, considering the question and all its implications. "I do not know what the future holds," he said finally, "but I know that tonight the world seems a little smaller and less frightening than it did this morning. Perhaps that is a beginning." As they parted for the night, both and carried with them the realization that their brief encounter had changed something fundamental in their understanding of enemies and friends, hatred and compassion, the possibilities for connection across even the deepest divides. The morning mist hung low over the Apache camp as prepared for his journey home. The night had passed peacefully, though sleep had come fitfully for many in the band who were still processing the unprecedented events of the previous day. Never before had their people hosted a Sioux warrior as a guest, and the implications of this gesture would be discussed around cooking fires for years to come. Chief had assigned 2 of his most trusted warriors, and to escort safely through Apache territory. It was both an honor guard and a practical precaution, ensuring that no harm would come to their guest while also demonstrating to any Apache patrols they might encounter that this Sioux warrior was under their protection. Stood near her lodge, watching the preparations with mixed emotions. The beautiful necklace that had given her rested against her throat, its weight a constant reminder of the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them together. Around her, she could feel the eyes of her band members, some still skeptical of her actions, others beginning to see them in a new light. The young warrior who had been her harshest critic approached as she stood watching. His expression was troubled, lacking the angry certainty that had characterized his earlier confrontations. "I have been thinking all night about what happened here," he said quietly. "About this Sioux warrior who risked everything to thank you." "And what conclusions have you reached?" asked. "I am not sure. Part of me still believes that showing mercy to enemies is dangerous folly. But seeing that man's face when he spoke of his brothers, hearing the gratitude in his voice," shook his head. "It is hard to maintain hatred for people who are capable of such honor." "Perhaps that is the beginning of wisdom," replied gently. "Not all Sioux are evil, just as not all Apache are good. We are all human beings trying to protect what we love." As the sun climbed higher, completed his preparations, and approached for their final farewell, the entire camp had gathered to witness this moment, understanding instinctively that they were observing something that would become part of their people's oral history. "I will carry word of your kindness back to my people," said formally. "And I will tell my children and about the Apache woman who showed that enemies can become friends through compassion." "May the spirits guard your path home," replied, "and may your brothers grow strong and wise under your protection." They stood facing each other for a moment, these two people from warring tribes who had found common ground in the love of children and the recognition of basic human decency. Then mounted his horse and rode out of the camp, flanked by his Apache escorts. The journey north took 3 days, during which and his escorts engaged in conversations that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. Despite their people's long history of conflict, they discovered shared experiences as warriors, hunters, and men trying to survive in a harsh and changing world. Who had initially viewed with deep suspicion, found himself developing a grudging respect for the Sioux warriors' courage and integrity. "You could have raided our horses, stolen our women, or brought warriors to attack us," he observed on their second night together. "Instead, you came alone, unarmed, seeking only to express gratitude. Either you are the most foolish man I have ever met, or the most honorable." "Perhaps both," replied with a smile that carried no hostility. "Honor sometimes requires what others call foolishness." When they reached the boundaries of Apache territory, the parting between former enemies carried a warmth that surprised all involved. Removed a small carved stone from his gear and offered it to. "A token of safe passage," he explained. "Should you ever find yourself in Apache lands again, show this to any of our warriors. They will know you are under our protection." Accepted the gift with genuine gratitude, understanding the significance of the gesture. "May we meet again in times of peace rather than war," he said. The final leg of his journey home gave him time to reflect on all that had transpired. He had set out seeking simply to thank a woman for saving his brothers, but he was returning with something far more valuable, a new understanding of the possibilities for peace between their peoples. When he finally rode into his own camp, the reception was tumultuous. Word of his departure on this dangerous mission had spread throughout the band, and many had given him up for dead. The fact that he was returning not only alive but unharmed, escorted partway by Apache warriors, seemed like a miracle. Chief Red Hawk called an immediate council meeting to hear his report. The story he told of his time in the Apache camp, of his acceptance of his thanks and Chief's hospitality, challenged many of the assumptions that had guided their tribal policies for generations. "You are saying that these Apache people treated you with honor?" asked Red Hawk, clearly struggling to reconcile this information with his own experiences. "More than honor," replied. "They treated me with kindness and respect, despite having every reason to kill me as an enemy. Their chief called me an honored guest and provided an escort for my safe return." The council session that followed was long and contentious, mirroring the debates that had taken place around the Apache fires weeks earlier. Some of the warriors saw this experience as proof that peace might be possible, while others viewed it as an aberration that changed nothing about the fundamental nature of their enemies. And now fully recovered from their ordeal, listened to their brother's account with shining eyes. For them, there was no contradiction in the idea of kind Apache people. They had lived it, experienced it firsthand in Slodge. "We told you she was special," said proudly. "Now maybe the grown-ups will believe us." In the weeks that followed, word of these extraordinary events spread far beyond the immediate camps involved. Other Apache and Sioux bands heard varying versions of the story, and it sparked discussions about the nature of their conflict and the possibilities for change. Some dismissed the events as anomalies that proved nothing about the larger relationship between their peoples. But others began to question whether the cycle of violence that had defined their interactions for so many generations was truly inevitable. For life in the Apache camp gradually returned to normal, but she was forever changed by her experience. The suspicion that had followed her after her rescue of the Sioux boys began to fade as people reflected on the honor that visit had brought to their band. To have an enemy warrior travel so far simply to thank one of their women spoke well of Apache compassion and wisdom. She continued to wear Smother's necklace, and people often asked about its significance. Each time she told the story, it reinforced the message that individual acts of kindness could transcend tribal boundaries and create unexpected connections. Chief, wise in the ways of leadership, used the events as a teaching tool for the younger members of the band. "See how one woman's courage to follow her heart rather than her fear created ripples that reached across hundreds of miles," he would say. "Never underestimate the power of a single act of compassion." The children of the band were particularly fascinated by the story, often begging to tell them again about the lost Sioux boys and their brave brother who rode so far to say thank you. These children grew up with a different perspective on their supposed enemies, understanding that beneath the paint and weapons were people capable of love, loyalty, and honor. As seasons passed into years, the story of and the lost boys became part of the oral tradition of both tribes. It was told around winter fires when the storms raged outside, a reminder that even in the darkest times, human kindness could create light. Never saw again, but he carried the memory of their meeting throughout his life. He became a voice for peace within his own tribe, using his experience with the Apache people to argue for dialogue rather than constant warfare. Not everyone listened, and conflicts continued, but the seed of possibility had been planted and grew into strong young men, but they never forgot the Apache woman who had saved their lives. In particular, became known for his unusual perspective on their enemies, often arguing that not all Apache were the same, that some were capable of great kindness. Years later, when both boys had become warriors themselves, they would sometimes encounter Apache people during trading sessions or brief truces. They always asked about, hopping for news of the woman who had shown them that enemies could become friends through simple human compassion. The winter storm that had brought them together lasted only a few days, but its effects rippled through generations. Children who might have grown up hating each other instead carried stories of unexpected kindness. Warriors who might have fought to the death instead remembered that their enemies were capable of honor and love. It did not end the conflicts between the Apache and Sioux peoples. Too much history, too many grievances, and too many competing interests stood in the way of immediate peace. But it planted seeds of understanding that would eventually grow into larger movements toward reconciliation. In her later years, became known as a wise woman whose counsel was sought on difficult matters. People would come to her when facing choices between safety and compassion, fear and hope. Her standard response was always the same: listen to your heart, but listen with courage. She never married again, but she found fulfillment in serving as a surrogate mother to many children in the band, particularly orphans who needed guidance and love. Her lodge became a place where young people could go for comfort and wisdom, and she told them stories not just of Apache heroes, but of the brave Sioux boys who had taught her about the power of love to transcend hatred. When died many years later, her funeral was attended by representatives from several tribes, including some Sioux who had traveled great distances to pay their respects. Among them was an elderly warrior with silver hair and kind eyes, accompanied by two middle-aged men who bore a strong resemblance to him, and had come to honor the woman who had changed their lives so many years before. They placed gifts on her grave: buffalo robes, eagle feathers, and sacred stones from their homeland. It was a gesture of respect that moved many in the Apache band to tears. "She showed us that the human heart is larger than tribal boundaries," said simply when asked why he had made this final journey. "The world is for her passing, but richer for her having lived." The story of and the lost Sioux boys became more than just a tale of individual kindness. It became a symbol of the possibility for understanding between peoples, a reminder that even the deepest divisions can be bridged by those brave enough to see the humanity in their supposed enemies. In a time when hatred often seemed easier than love and fear more natural than trust, their story stood as proof that another way was possible. It suggested that the future did not have to be bound by the conflicts of the past, that individual choices could create ripples of change that spread far beyond their origins. Most importantly, it demonstrated that sometimes the greatest courage is not found in fighting enemies, but in recognizing that those we call enemies are not so different from ourselves. In showing kindness to two lost children had opened a door to understanding that would never fully close again. The storm had ended, but the warmth it generated through one woman's compassionate heart continued to provide light and heat for generations to come.